Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our very first More Than a Story seminar for 2023. The More Than a Story seminar series is convened by the Family History program at the University of Tasmania. My name is Carla Pascoe Leahy. I'm one of the teachers in the Family History program, and we have Imogen Wegman in the background supporting us this evening as well. So I'll be your host and facilitator tonight. But before we begin, I'd like to do an acknowledgement of country. The University of Tasmania was founded in Lutruwita, or Tasmania. In the spirit of reconciliation, the university respectfully acknowledges the Lutruwita nations. The university also recognises the Aboriginal history and culture of the land and acknowledges and pays respect to the traditional owners and to elders past, present and emerging of the land on which all UTAS campuses sit. Our presenters and audience today are zooming in from all over Australia, and we'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which you're joining us from. So tonight, we're looking forward to a very exciting webinar. We're exploring the links between food history and family history. We all know that gathering to share special meals and to mark special occasions has been a ritual of family life across most cultures and most time periods. And we've also probably all experienced the ways in which food traditions and special recipes are often passed down within families and strengthen family ties. Tonight, we're very lucky to speak with two experts in histories of cooking, eating and drinking. So Dr. Lauren Samuelsson holds a PhD in history and is an honorary fellow at the University of Wollongong. Lauren's research interests include cultural history, the history of food and drink, the history of popular culture and gender history. Her PhD looked at the influence of the Australian Women's Weekly and cookbooks on the development of Australian food culture from the 1930s to the 1980s. She's also worked on the social and cultural history of liquor legislation in New South Wales. Lauren's award-winning academic work has been published in respected history journals and media outlets. Her work as a digital curator and web designer for an online exhibition won the 2022 History Council of New South Wales Addie Road Award for Multicultural History. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Lauren. And Dr. Alison Vincent is a cultural historian with qualifications in both science and history. Until 2022, she was adjunct senior lecturer at the Creative Arts Research Training Academy at Central Queensland University. Alison is a founding member and co-convener of the Australian Food History Network, which supports academic research into historical aspects of the cultivation, production, consumption and distribution of food and beverages both in and beyond Australia. Alison studies Australia's food culture, including the social history of dining out, the history of cookery books and food writing in Australia, and the influences on Australian foodways. Alison regularly publishes in online journals and in forums like The Conversation. Her current project looks at influential female food writers in Australia, who they were, what they wrote, and how they shaped Australian tastes, which she hopes will become a book. And thank you very much for joining us tonight, Alison. So many of you in the audience will have attended our More Than a Story webinars before, but for those that haven't, I'll just briefly explain the structure of the event. So Alison and Lauren and I are going to join me in a conversation about food history, and we'll draw upon their research expertise, tell us what they've studied. And then we'll open up to questions and discussion with the audience in the last section of the webinar. So as this is a webinar, what that means is that audience members can see the presenters, but you can't see other audience members. And the same goes for us presenters. We can't see you, but we can see what you type in the chat and the Q&A. So if you have a burning question that you'd like to ask, you can put it in the Q&A area, which we'll be monitoring, and we'll get to your questions in the last section of the webinar. And then the webinar will be ending at 7 p.m. So let's get started, because I have a suspicion that we're going to have a lot to talk about tonight. Now, first of all, I'm really interested for both Alison and Lauren in understanding how you first became interested in food history. Lauren, do you want to explain to us a little bit how you came to research this topic?
Sure. I really like to eat, and I think that that's where it stemmed from. So I was always really interested in the way that history of food and drink can really tell us a lot more about society and culture than we would ordinarily think if we're just looking at a meal. And when I was deciding to do my PhD, I wanted to focus on Australian history. And when I thought about Australian food and Australian food history, my mind sort of immediately went to the Women's Weekly, which is why I chose to study it. And I'm very glad that I did. It's been fascinating.
Lauren, I think we can all relate to that, and particularly, yes, your love of food. Alison, how did you get started in this particular area of research?
Well, as you said in the introduction, I studied food technology at university in the days when you could do that. And so my interest was chemistry and microbiology, and a bit of chemical engineering, food processing, that sort of stuff. So food was what I did for my job, and history was what I did for my hobby, I suppose. And so then I actually went back to university and did a degree in Australian history. And I suppose it was from reading books like, let me think, Mark Kalansky's sort of history of New York from the oyster's point of view. And there's a wonderful book by Margaret Visser, Much Depends on Dinner. That sort of made me, I guess I had some one of these light bulb moments that said, well, why don't I combine my interest in history and my knowledge of food? And like Lauren, you know, I like to eat. And particularly my research was all about restaurants and restaurant reviews, and that was something that I knew about because when I was first at university, you read in the days when there were newspapers, you read all about food, and so yeah, it was just a natural progression, I guess, a combination of both the things that I was really interested in.
And that's interesting too, because you're citing the influence of other historians on our work, and I guess the power of other historians and their work to inspire us, which I'm sure many people have experienced. Lauren, you mentioned the Australian Women's Weekly, and I was immediately fascinated. I've also used that myself for very different kinds of historical research. I'm really curious about what kinds of sources you've looked at, and I guess why you've chosen them, and then how you've analysed them. Because I guess the perhaps frustrating thing about food history is food doesn't last forever. We can't actually, it's not like a marble bust that we can put in a museum. So yeah, I'm really interested in your choice of historical sources.
Yeah, so I used the Australian Women's Weekly magazines, which are available on Trove, which is wonderful. I focused on the weekly when it was still a weekly magazine. So it turned into a monthly magazine in 1983. So I looked at the period 1933 to 1982, which was just shy of 50 years, which was just doesn't work, but it's okay. What I did was I looked at two different types of recipes that were submitted in that magazine. One of them were the recipes that the food editor conglomerated together, put in their editorial for the week. And that usually had some sort of theme or something along those lines. And then there was also a weekly recipe competition where readers would actually send in their recipes, and they had the chance to make a little bit of money and, you know, get accolades as well, which was obviously more to the point. So I looked at those, and if I had have looked at all of them for the whole 50 years, I probably would have never finished my PhD. So I did a slice sampling approach and looked at various months in 5-year increments. I looked at all of the recipes. I broke them down into their ingredients, into the cooking techniques that we used, all of those sorts of things, which allowed me to then sort of see patterns in the way that we ate. And from there, I could go and look further into those patterns. I also looked at the weekly's cookbooks, but I didn't do that recipe analysis on the cookbooks. It was more looking at the cookbooks as a form of material history, and sort of seeing them, I guess, in a more broad sense.
I'm going to ask you the same question in a minute, Alison, but I'm curious, Lauren, can you tell me in the audience, what do you mean? What does it mean to look at cookbooks as a form of material history? Can you explain that?
Yeah. So as you said, you know, we don't really, when we're studying food, we don't really have much to go off unless we're archaeologists, you know, digging around and finding, you know, shells and things like that, bones, which I do not do. So what I can do though is I can look at older cookbooks, and the cookbooks that I looked at were generally ones that I got at secondhand stalls or that people donated to me, which was very kind. And when you actually look at those books, the books themselves can tell you a story. So you might flip it open and it will automatically open on the page that has been opened the most. And it might be a chocolate cake page, and there's splatters of batter all over the page. People write in the margins. They tell you whether or not they liked it or whether it's successful, what they might have changed, who they cooked it for. So we can see all of those things and the decision-making process that people make in actually making those foods. Because looking at recipes in magazines doesn't really tell us what people actually ate. It tells us what people thought they should be eating, or what was, you know, in trend, those sorts of things, but it doesn't necessarily tell us what people ate, whereas we can sort of see in the cookbooks whether or not people were sort of using them.
That's such a clever approach to that question, and also a really important point for all of us doing research about sort of the possibilities and the limitations of different sources. Marion, in mid-North Coast New South Wales, has also told us that one of her favourite cookbooks is the Australian Women's Weekly Best Ever Recipes, and I'm sure many people will probably know what Marion's referring to, and indeed which pages were most well worn there. Alison, can you tell us a little bit about what kinds of historical sources you've chosen to use and why? And I guess, yeah, what are some of the possibilities and pitfalls of the sources that you've looked at?
As a historian, I guess I sort of figure that my sources are all around me one way or another. So I suppose as a food historian, you look at cookbooks perhaps more often than most historians would do, but all the traditional historical resources. So you're always looking at newspapers, at magazines. For food particularly, contemporary literature is often interesting, because even in their memoirs, very few people give you any specific information about food. So they'll say that they went out to dinner with someone, but they won't bother to tell you what they ate. Or they might tell you that they went to a restaurant, but they won't bother to tell you what it looked like. So ephemera like menus, for example, are very useful. But I think we also forget that food history is sort of written on our urban environment as well. So I live in a street, for example, where there's a block of home units down the end of the street, which is actually built on the footprint of the jam factory that used to be there. And out in the back lane, there's the remains of a confectionery factory. And down the road, they used to make biscuits. And the corner shop tells you that people were buying their food locally. So what did they sell, and you know, where did their food come from? And all that, as Lauren mentioned, material culture. You know, one of the things my family will tell you wherever we go, if we go to a historic house, the only places I'm really interested in are the kitchen and the dining room. And if we visit anywhere, you go to the markets to just see what people are buying, how they're selling it. And they will give you clues to how all this might have gone on in the past as well. So my sources are pretty much anything I can get my hands on.
That's such a great point, Alison, about how that sort of food has seeped into the very bricks and mortar of the urban fabric around us. And you also make me think of ghost, you know, so-called ghost signs. You know, when there's traces
yes.
of old signs that could be food advertisements, for example, you know, on the side of buildings. You mentioned ephemera like menus. Are they hard to track down? Do museums customarily collect that kind of thing, for example?
Not on the sort of regular basis that I would like. There's certainly a collection of menus at the National Library. There's a collection of menus at the State Library here in Sydney. I think William Angliss down in Melbourne have a decent collection. The main problem with a lot of them is that they're not necessarily dated. So you need to use a lot of guesswork to try and work out where they, where they might fit in. And some of them just don't have, they might say, what's the name of a restaurant? Checkers, for example, but they won't actually have an address on them either. So you then have to sort of do a lot of fiddling about. But the most useful menus actually are the ones that were produced for special occasions. So they will actually have the date and often who was present and perhaps a list of toasts and that sort of thing as well. So yes, menus are not collected as much as they should be. And if anybody has a collection of menus, then I strongly urge them to donate them to a library somewhere.
Oh, you're giving me a headache just thinking about the difficulties of referencing sources that don't have dates and other kinds of really, really central information like that on them. I'm curious, as you're both talking, about what you see as some of the connections between food history and family history. I think many of us would intuitively feel that there are connections between food and family in our lives, but particularly in the sort of the domains of research where people are conducting historical research. What's some of the intersections and overlap between food history and family history? Do you want to tell me your thoughts on that, Lauren?
Yeah, I mean, certainly in terms of food and family, I'm sure that people, have that sort of that feeling that people have about food, and this is a family recipe and those sorts of things. I think that when we're sort of researching family history, using food as a sort of jumping off point can be pretty useful. And I think that in a lot of ways that food history and family history is very much gendered, and it's a way that we can actually focus on women in the family. Family cookbooks, for example, are passed down generally, mother to daughter, those sorts of things. I've got a friend who has, graciously loaned me her grandma's cookbook that she had compiled that had been passed down to her. So we have those sorts of things, and even within those cookbooks, there's information about family friends, other relatives. I got this recipe from Auntie Susan. Well, who's Auntie Susan? Maybe we can go on a hunt for Auntie Susan. So we do have those sorts of things as well, and I do think that food being so linked to women is one of the more important things I think that we can get from that within sort of studying family history.
Yeah, and that's such an interesting point of what you make about gender and food, and one that perhaps might be changing in the 21st century as cooking practices diversify. Oh, Alison, what do you think about these connections, and I suppose also the question of how food research might be of interest to or benefit to family historians?
Well, I think that, if you scratch the surface of almost any story, there's food in there somewhere. So for a lot of Australians who are researching an immigrant family history, for example, a lot of the reasons why immigrants came here in the first place was sort of food related, if you like. They came here to work in the food industry. They were forced out of wherever it was they were living because of a scarcity of food. They tried to recreate as much as they could the food culture that they were used to here. And again, I think about the urban environment. We've been house hunting recently and looking at a lot of houses that have been owned by Greek and Italian families up until quite recently, and they all have this layout in their back garden to grow vegetables in a way, on an almost industrial scale, which it tells you so much about how that family lived and what the important things were for them. So food provided them with jobs. It provided women with jobs, going out, acting as cookery instructors. Girls were all given cooking instruction at school. So you can tell a lot about the way a family's food culture developed from looking at the sorts of things that these girls were taught to do using the Common Sense cookbook, which was around for donkeys. Well, it's still around. So I think if you look at it from the point of view of how did these people live, then you have to ask the question, what did they eat? How did they get their food? How did they cook it? What sort of technology did they have in the kitchen? So if you want to really get a picture of how the people in the past lived, then you really need to understand what they were doing about feeding themselves.
Well, and I know you famously said to me when we were talking the other day, Alison, that all history is really about food, which I think is a wonderful quote that I'm gonna take with me. And you argue it very persuasively. Maybe I need to take up food history. But also your comment about technology puts me in mind of something else that I think we've been circling around, which is about the spaces of cooking and eating and the technologies of cooking and eating. So what do you think, Alison, about this question of how has changing technology influenced both what we cook and also domestic architecture, the spaces in which we cook?
Well, domestic architecture is probably one of the most obvious ones, because back in the day, cooking was a bit of a dangerous pastime. You had lots of open flames and those sorts of things. So the kitchen was always at the back of the house, and gradually it's worked its way into being the sort of centre of the home. Although I'd have to say that nowadays we're moving back again. So we've got a kitchen in the centre of the home, and then we've got the outdoor kitchen, which is where we do the sort of dangerous pyrotechnical sort of stuff. But people used to cook with a stove that had absolutely no temperature control. In fact, when I first moved into this terrace house we live in now, we had an early cooker in the kitchen, and it was either on or it was off. There was, all you could do was sort of twiddle with the knobs and hope that you didn't turn the gas down so far that it went out. In the day, women just understood how their stove worked. These days, we rely very much on a recipe that says, set the oven to this temperature and it'll only take 25 minutes to cook. Well, in the past, you had to rely on smell. You could smell when the food was about cooked. You would rely on hearing as well. When you were frying something, it was too hot if it was spitting and spattering everywhere. So we've really the reliance on cookbooks has come from the fact that we now have technology to do so many of those jobs for us. We don't spend hours in the kitchen chopping anything anymore. We stick it in the food process. So the house reflects that. So now most of the kitchen technology is electrical of some sort. So if you have a blackout, you're in serious trouble. And our houses have just become, so we still center life around the kitchen, but the whole kitchen process is so much cleaner than it used to be. So in the past, you would have wood in the kitchen, or you would have coal in the kitchen. You'd have to be cleaning the stove out all the time. Life has become very much easier in very many ways. Refrigeration, for example, you don't have to go up, you don't have to wait for the iceman to come and bring you a block of ice to keep stuff cool. We don't know how lucky we are.
Well, and I think what you're saying too is gesturing to the difference between cooking through the senses and through feel or intuition, and maybe cooking from sort of more strictly and rigidly from a recipe with fine control over the exact amount of ingredients or the exact temperature. And I think when we also still see that variation, I think, between people's sort of habits and styles of cooking and how they prefer to cook. But Lauren, has this come up in your research as well? This sort of question of how changing technologies and spaces interact with changing foods that we cook and consume?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that those technologies have really had an impact, I think, on the way that families eat, and particularly on in the research that I've looked at the way that sort of that outdoor kitchen that Alison was talking about was actually a space where men felt that they felt comfortable to cook. Cooking indoors was not for men, but cooking outdoors over the barbecue, those sorts of things, absolutely fine. You could remain masculine. So I've sort of looked at the way that that sort of changed in Australia. And I think that being able to rely on technology back in the kitchen, things like slow cookers and microwaves and those sorts of things, that were sort of touted as being the next best thing that's going to help us get rid of kitchen drudgery forever. That never really ended up doing that. You know, we still have to cook. You have to put things into the slow cooker and have to deal with that. I think that they were sort of, you know, in reaction to, or were certainly like advertised in a way to help women, you know, cope with their food problems, and the problem of feeding a family in an interesting way, week after week, day after day, which I think is really interesting.
Well, and it touches on so many different issues, doesn't it? Alison, I know that you've looked a little bit at the question of sort of home economics, you know, and how we might teach people about cooking in all sorts of different fora. What are your thoughts on how the expertise of the average Australian cook has changed over time as viewed through your research?
That's tricky, isn't it? Because I would have said that women in the past, women say who were cooking in the 1920s and 1930s, had to be a lot more intuitive. They had fewer ingredients to choose from, a more restricted budget. And if they were going to try and make interesting food, they had to rely on their own knowledge of flavourings to achieve that, which is partly, I suppose, why the old saying that you know, food before the Second World War was bland, boring and British, because most of the cookbooks would say, I think Lawrence mentioned this before, you know, they would say, you know, put these ingredients together and cook in the usual way. So it didn't say specifically, you know, add half a teaspoon of this and a bunch of that and a few lees of the other thing. And we tend to think that people didn't do that. But my thinking would be that they probably did, that was just unspoken, that was just expected, that you would have your little herb garden and you would be adding bits and pieces to them. So I would be inclined to say that women were, say, cooked more intuitively in the past. Whether women today don't cook as well, I think is a different point, because I think that people, I love my sweeping statements. So I would say that people who are interested in food and are interested and enjoy eating still are creative about the way they cook. So for a lot of people, a recipe book is really just a list of suggestions, and they you know, work from that. For a lot of people, the recipe book will still be, I have to do it all step by step by step by step. What's happened, of course, in the recent past is that television has changed all that, and so people who haven't necessarily grown up in a household where cooking was considered something that you would actually take an interest in rather than something you simply had to do, they've been able to see how food can look. And again, that's something that's changed in recipe books. In the past, they were very, you know, they were just full of words. And once recipe books had pictures of how the food was supposed to look, people could be a lot more interested in what they were doing. So I think some changes for the worse, in as much as I think people become a bit too reliant on recipes. But if it makes people who wouldn't have cooked before a bit more adventurous with the flavors and things they use, then maybe that's all to the good.
I think I wonder too if the increasing focus of television shows on cooking has heightened our expectations of ourselves and of other cooks. Because certainly when I watch something like MasterChef, I think, wow, we've really taken the expectations we might have of a professional chef into the domestic environment and set, a very high standard for ourselves, which is, might be intimidating if you're not very comfortable with cooking. But equally, I think despite the sort of shifting influence of media and popular culture, there seems to me to be something quite intrinsic to the role of food in our lives, which is that it has an emotional role as well. Like on the most basic of levels, we must eat to live as humans, but food also has these individual and collective emotional resonances for us. And I know that's something that you're interested in as well, Lauren. Do you want to comment on how the emotional inflections of food might appear in your research?
Yeah. One of the reasons that I chose to study the Women's Weekly was because I remember when I was a kid, sitting with the Women's Weekly children's birthday cake book, perched, at my family's breakfast bar, just like flipping through, choosing my birthday cake and feeling just so excited that I was A, having a birthday, and B, like my mum was going to make me this really special cake. And I think that sort of emotion that we get around food, whether it is for a special occasion, it might be something that we tried when we were on holiday. And I think because we use so many of our senses when we eat, it's a really sort of like overwhelming thing. And certainly I did a survey of readers of the weekly and how they used the cookbooks and what they remembered. And so many of them remembered, feeling special because, they made this wonderful meal and their friends, praised them. And all of those sorts of things that are really like personally emotional. And I know that there is like collective emotion as well. But I think when it comes to the sort of food that I look at, that sort of domestic, everyday food, it is quite a personal sort of emotion that we attach to that food.
And we all have, sorry, Alison, go ahead.
One of the things that Lauren didn't mention was that she did some oral history research as well. And I think that oral history is a really important part of tracing the food story, because we can over-romanticize the idea of the family meal and what a wonderful time that is for everyone to be convivial. And because for a lot of people, their memories of family dinners are woeful. They were times of great tension where that whole gender balance thing got played out in a very meaningful way, because dad would sit at the head of the table and no one was prepared to talk, and we only ever ate what dad liked, and we had to always wait until dad got home to have dinner. So there's all sorts of interesting things play out around that whole idea of dinner time.
Yeah, and there is also like a lot of tension to do with embarrassment about food, particularly for children of migrants, that were embarrassed of food that they took to school for lunches, and they would get picked on and all. So it's not all sunshine, daisies and fuzzies. Food is definitely complex.
Well, and food can be used for sort of disciplining as well, can't it, within the family? Lauren, what are your thoughts about the question of the sort of moral judgments that we might attach to different types of food, good food and bad food, and how that plays out in Australian society?
Yeah, so as part of my research, I looked at fad diets from the 1970s through to the 1980s, and the way that women self-surveilled, basically, and sort of self-flagellated over their food choices, and the way that sort of the media contributed to that, but also how they spoke to each other about their food choices. So there were a couple of dieting competitions that the Women's Weekly held in the 1950s and 60s, and wow, you know, the way that women would speak about themselves and their food choices, you know, calling themselves, you know, fat and ugly and all of these sorts of things, and the way that they then used food to control their feelings about themselves is really quite, you know, quite confronting. And the idea that food is good and bad in that sort of situation really, really comes through. But the different types of foods that people thought were good and bad were often incredibly contradictory. So some people would say, you know, no, fat is terrible, and then on the same page you had someone saying to basically, you know, take up what was a proto sort of Atkins diet, you know. So there was no agreement about what was good or bad, and those sort of cultural, I guess, creations of what was good and bad sort of came from people's personal contexts as well. And then, of course, there is a broader sort of good and bad of food, things that we think are disgusting. You know, we would certainly look back on some of the recipes that I have, you know, seen quite a bit of and just think, what, why? Like you couldn't even imagine eating it. So there is that sort of idea of disgust being bad as well. Yeah.
Well, that brings me to the thing that I really wanted to ask you both, and I'm sure is on everyone's mind, which is what is the most unusual recipe or story associated with food that you've come across? Alison, you go first.
Oh, that's really hard because I guess sort of certainly every recipe book you read through, you think, oh, that's a bit odd. I know Lauren will probably mention mock foods, some of the things that that, in fact, I'll leave you to talk about mock foods because you know much more about it than I do. I was looking the other day at my mother's cookbook she had when she was first married, and it was published just after the Second World War, and it's got recipes in it for using whale meat, for example. And you know, I had, and this was in England at the time, and you know, you just can't imagine how people who'd never had to eat anything like that before would have even contemplated. I'd sooner go hungry, I think, than try and eat whale meat. The Common Sense cookbook that I've got a copy of that has some detailed instructions for how to make coffee, for example. And you can't imagine that anybody ever needed instructions on how to make coffee. But I'm afraid I don't have a grim story. I think of Mrs. Lance Rawson's books that were written in the late 19th century, and she's got recipes for if you were in desperate straits for cooking things like ibis and goanna and stuff like that. But I think they were rather more sort of, they were included to shock, I think, perhaps, rather than to be particularly useful to anybody.
I'm now just really curious about what ibis and goanna might taste like.
Oh, she didn't really recommend either of them, to be honest. So.
What about you, Lauren? What are some of the things that seem most unusual that you've come across?
Yeah, so Alison was talking about mock foods, and that's something that I sort of flagged when I was doing that sort of overarching research. And basically these were foods that were designed to either look like something else, taste like something else when that thing was scarce. So there are some real stretches. There during the Second World War, for example, there was a time where potatoes weren't rationed, but they were in, you know, pretty low supply. So people suggested to make mock mashed potatoes, which is basically just sort of like a mixture of flour and water. Possibly
not very appetizing.
I mean, it's just that's just quite disgusting. But there was also things like people would pretend that rabbit was actually chicken and those sorts of things, because rabbit was considered to be a sort of lower status meat than chicken was. Chicken was quite expensive, it was quite special, and rabbit, you know, were incredibly cheap. They were poor people's food. And so by calling it chicken, transforming it into chicken, it was made quite special. And I think that the other thing that sort of comes up over and over again in my research is just how far people went in the use of jelly. Everything could and would be jellied. I remember when I first started doing my research and I came across this recipe, and it was you sliced up bananas and you covered them in orange jelly. Sounds great. Sounds fun. Like, that's okay. I probably would have eaten that when I was a kid. But then you served it on a bed of lettuce and topped it with mayonnaise.
What era was this recipe?
1930s. It was a nice light luncheon for the housewife.
A healthy jelly salad.
Yes, yes. And jelly sort of is not something that we eat a lot of anymore. So you would be surprised at how often it crops up.
Look, I'm going to turn to some of our audience questions, because we have a wonderful audience today that's popped lots of interesting questions down for us to consider. Maybe following on from what we were just talking about, Jennifer's curious about your favourite cookbook finds of all time, and perhaps the author or the time period that they're from. Alison, do you have any thoughts about that?
I think one of my favourites is Ted Maloney's O for a French Wife, only because it's sort of quite irreverent for the time. It suddenly starts not taking food quite so seriously. It has some rather risque illustrations in it as well, which again was very strange for the time. And it's written by a man, which was also, so it was written in the early 50s, 57, I'm going to say, which, you know, at that time was pretty unusual. But there are lots of really really quirky things. There's a little book that I've got on my desk here somewhere, which is written by a guy called Donovan Clark, who was an writer. And it's one of the first books that's got a whole lot of European recipes in it. One of the things that's in O for French Wife is, I think it's O for French Wife. It's a Chinese meal, and sweet and sour pork. And one of the instructions has you chop up the capsicum and then boil it first, so that it's sort of nice and soft before you throw it in. So that's the era that I particularly like, that sort of changeover from the really serious books where you know everything was spelled out and you did it this way and it all had to be proper. And then suddenly in this sort of post-war era, you get all these quirky and more interesting books.
Lauren, do you have a favourite cookbook?
Yes, I've got it right here. The Busy Woman's Cookbook. 1972, it was advertised as being for the liberated woman. And I just love it just because of the cover and the sweet and sour pork on the back. Look at that.
That's glorious.
What a delight.
And what an interesting example of wider cultural changes influencing cooking and cookbooks as well. Julie has asked about the CWA, and I think she's possibly, she says she regards them as the epitome of country baking and still inspirational today. So what are your thoughts about either the CWA as an organisation or the recipe books that they produced? Have you come across traces of their influence?
I haven't. I have to say I haven't specifically, other than that some of them have been being produced for a very, very long time, different community groups producing them, and they as a community building exercise, they were just sensational. The funds that they've raised for different organisations, but all those community based recipe books are really interesting because they not only represent the sort of cooking of particular groups, particular places, but they were also an opportunity for women to band together and sort of move into the realm of doing things for themselves, if you like, raising money for themselves. They had to go along and speak to publishers. They had to, they had to have a committee to organise all the recipes and all that, get the whole thing actually published. So they were very important to say building communities, but sort of empowering women to get out there and do things for themselves.
We've got another question that might follow on from that a little bit, and I suppose we can think about whether there are perhaps differences between urban and regional and rural styles of cooking, but that which is sort of hinted at in this question, but it's also asking something different. Fleur is asking, as she says, we've moved to the country and are living partially off grid. Do you think that some people are choosing to eat in a more simple way again? So I think that was probably following on from your comments, Alison, about the increasing sophistication of technology changing cooking practices. Do you see any evidence of a shift towards simpler ways of living more recently?
That's a good question. I don't know about the moving away from the city so much, but I think that for a lot of urban families, because there is so much takeaway food as well, that if you want something that's a bit more jazzy, you can go out and get it. At home, you're still more likely to be, having sausages and mashed potatoes. But there's also, I mentioned before that this idea that food in the past used to be bland, boring, and British. The idea that on Sunday you would have a roast, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, you were probably repurposing that roast in some way or another. Thursday, if you were lucky, you might get something a bit different on the table. Friday, you would have fish. Saturday, you might have something a bit fancy, and then it would be back to the roast on Sunday again. Now, we tend to think of that as pretty old-fashioned, but I think if you scratch the surface of most households, that's pretty much what's still going on. That people don't necessarily have a big cook-up on Sunday, but they perhaps produce something on Monday that they can repurpose for Tuesday, and then there'll be, something cheap and cheerful for Wednesday. That people aren't producing the sort of stuff that you see on MasterChef every night of the week, and I think that the whole idea of eating healthy, eating less red meat, tends to make people think a bit more about what they're doing. The advantage that we have is that, of course, we can easily make sorts of food that we cook very tasty because we have access to such a range of spices. We can grow our own herbs. There's endless stuff in the supermarket that you can buy to make cooking easier. I think probably for a lot of people in the home, and particularly, obviously, if you've got children, you can't be cooking fancy stuff every night of the week. And I think people probably are more health conscious than they have been in the past. That makes a big difference.
We've got so many wonderful questions, and I fear that we're not going to get to all of them. I suspected you two would be too interesting for your own good. But I would like us to circle back to family, and there's a question. Julie said that her COVID lockdown project was putting together a family recipe book. And she said it sort of became a family history illustrated by recipes. So she's curious about whether either of you know of books that are about traditions of recipes handed down through generations. And Nikki's asked a similar question about what someone can do with their own family cookbooks and journals. So do either of you have comments about sources that you found that are essentially the compiling of family cooking traditions, or have seen things that people have done with those kinds of traditions in cookbooks? What about you, Lauren?
I would say if you have any of those books and you would like to donate them to your library, please do, because that's something that I have really wanted to research, is how to have a look at those family compiled cookbooks. But you know, there is just nowhere in libraries to find them. They're rare as hen's teeth. So feel free, if you do not want to keep them yourselves and would like to donate them, because they are, I think, really, really useful sources, because it shows us, you know, often they're like things that people have clipped out or shared between each other in their little handwritten notes, and it can tell us so much about what people actually did want to cook and did cook and all of those things. And I think they're really, really important sources that we just don't have enough of. In terms of finding sources like that, yeah, it's tough. It's very tough.
Really original ones that are actually, you know, written by just anybody, for want of a better term. Because you know, if you look around, there are a number of published books, and I can't think of the titles of any of them off the top of my head, needless to say, where people have supposedly collected their family's recipes, and you know, this is my contribution to the cookbook genre. I would raise a word of caution. I went to the trouble of writing a collection of recipes for my children, which were the recipes that I had cooked as they were growing up, so that they would have a reference if, when it got to the stage where they said, oh, mum's rice pudding was always so much better than everybody else's, they could actually go back and recreate mum's rice pudding. I would have to say, though, that neither of them, I think, have ever cooked anything out of the book, but the record is there should they need it. And I'd have to say too that whilst that was the record of what we ate, some of the pages were just photocopies of pages out of recipe books that had been my inspiration. And what I did was give them the original recipe and then what I had done to it to make it easier or quicker or tastier or whatever. So it's a very worthwhile exercise. And I agree with Lauren that if anybody has any old manuscript recipe books that they're willing to donate to a library, they are a fabulous resource for historians like us.
Well, and there's some wonderful comments here. I think it's Toby said, I have a cookbook from my husband's mother, which was made over 100 years ago from New Zealand. I have no idea about some of the ingredients in it. And so clearly people have some of these things in their families. Bronwyn says, I've tried for 40 years to replicate my grandmother's ice cream recipe. I can still taste it. It reminds me of our special times together. But I think she says that she's still failing to replicate the exact taste of that ice cream. And Rhonda says that the Society of Australian Genealogists have a cookbook coming out this year where members have compiled some of this information. And just for those who are interested, Nikki tells me that the Janice Bluestein Longone Culinary Archive at the University of Michigan holds lots of these community and personal materials with a US focus. And perhaps, you know, some of this discussion might allow people to look at some of the old cookbooks and recipe fragments hanging around their own homes and families with new light, to see it, you know, not just as a dog-eared, chocolate-stained scrap of paper, but as an important historical record potentially for historians. I think we might have time for just to answer one more question. Nikki's asked, in terms of family history, food also shapes employment. So migrants and production, selling food, and therefore structures domestic life, from delivering milk to running stores, etc. Alison, do you have any comments on some of these employment avenues within families and that sort of slightly different aspect of family history that food might relate to?
Yeah, I think we sometimes forget that whole the whole business of food is much simpler these days, because we just go to the supermarket and buy what we want. And again, that's changing to some extent, because some people do want to go back and buy bread from the bakery. But yes, we forget that people, there was a time when you got your milk delivered, for example, and you had to get up early enough to get to it before the birds pecked a hole in the foil top. So that when we're talking family history, particularly that whole idea, yes, that it was often employment that determined where people lived, because they, if you were delivering milk, you needed to be somewhere where you could get the milk easily. If you were delivering ice, then you needed to be able to get to the ice works and get it out and about. And it was that whole idea that food determined where people lived applies to a whole lot of, the reason why lots of servicemen went and lived in the soldier settlements that were set up to produce dried fruit in the irrigation area and all those sorts of things. So it really becomes, this is why food is so important, because it influenced so much to do with people's lives. People who were cooks worked in very difficult circumstances. Often it was hot. Well, it still is, but it was hot and it was smoky. They were working long hours. There were, domestic servants spent a lot of time cooking and preparing food, serving food, shopping for food. Very time consuming. And I think I've lost track of what I was saying.
I was just thinking, Alison, that I think you've thoroughly convinced us all that, what did you say? All history is really about food. Look, thank you both so much for sharing your expertise with us tonight. I feel that this has been a really engaging and fascinating session, and I think all of us find that our lives connect with food history in different ways, and we're probably now looking at those aspects of our lives in slightly different ways. I think that many of us in the audience will have something to do with family history, and this might inspire us to think about those old recipe books and cookbooks in a different way as resources. So the session's been recorded, and for anyone else that wants to view it, or if you want to see it again, it will be posted to YouTube. So everyone that's registered for the session will receive that link, and it will be on our channel, along with all of our previous More Than a Story webinars. And I'm excited to say that we have 3 more webinars coming up across the year. So they'll run in May, August and October. And our next webinar is going to be on Wednesday, the 24th of May, where we'll be looking at families and war with 2 very special guests, Bart Zeno from Deakin University and Joanne Smedley from the Australian War Memorial. And Imogen has kindly just popped the link to register in the chat if you'd like to jump in and register for that next webinar in May. But for now, please join me in thanking Lauren and Alison. I know they can't see or hear you clapping, but they'll feel it. And clap them wherever you are in deep appreciation for their time and their expertise tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. Bye-bye.